Hello, everyone out there in virtual webinar land, and welcome to this Heterodox Academy virtual event on measuring campus expression. I'm Alex Arnold. I'm the Director of Research at Heterodox Academy. I also help oversee the Siegel Center for Academic Pluralism, which is an internal think tank of Heterodox Academy. I'm joined today by Dr. Sean Stevens. He'll say a little bit more about himself in just a bit. But before we get into further introductions, just wanted to say a little bit about what the purpose of these virtual events are. They're really an opportunity to sort of peel back the curtain or the veil on what's happening at Heterodox Academy at our world headquarters in Manhattan. Also an opportunity to convene our members, our fellow travelers, and people who are just interested in advancing the cause of open inquiry on our college and university campuses around the world, to have a real enlivening and enlightening discussion about an issue that is connected with open inquiry, viewpoint diversity, or constructive disagreement. So because this is a webinar and we are going to be reserving some time at the end of our discussion for webinar participants to ask questions and for us to discuss those questions, I do want to make sure that everyone involved is cognizant of the fact that we want to conduct ourselves in accordance with the highest intellectual standards. And so the way we here at Heterodox Academy kind of encode those standards is by talking about what we label the HxA way. And there are kind of 5 planks of the HxA way. The first is that we always want to make our case. We want to make arguments on the basis of evidence and with reasons. We want to be intellectually charitable to one another. We don't want to straw man anyone's position. We want to make sure that even when we disagree with someone, that we're disagreeing with the very strongest variant of their position. And we want to, make sure that we ascribe good motives to people, that we assume others are arguing and discussing in good faith with us. We want to be intellectually humble. We want to be aware of the limitations of our own perspective, of our own arguments, of our own positions. We want to be constructive. We don't just want to naysay and complain and disagree for the sake of disagreeing, but we want to actually build arguments and evidence and a case so that we can arrive at better understanding and truth and knowledge, right? And then finally, we want to be ourselves. We don't want to self-censor ourselves. We don't want to put on airs. We don't want to fake it. We really want to bring our own perspective, our own beliefs, our own arguments, our own insights to the table. So for those of you who are members of Heterodox Academy, thank you for being members. For those of you who are maybe not members of Heterodox Academy, we want to encourage you, if you are connected with a university or college in some way, whether you're a student, whether you're a faculty member, whether you're staff, we want to encourage you to become a member. So we've got a QR code up there on the screen that you can scan for that purpose. And we also want to encourage anyone, even if you're not necessarily formally affiliated with a university or a college, to consider subscribing to our email newsletter, which comes out on a weekly basis, at least at this point. We'll be shifting some things around in the near future, but so go ahead and scan those QR codes, become a member, subscribe to our email, and in the meantime, buckle up and let's have a great discussion about measuring campus expression. So I've already introduced myself. I'm Alex Arnold. I'm the Director of Research here at Heterodox Academy. I'm responsible for overseeing a small research team we have and running a variety of different research projects, including what is our flagship research project, the Campus Expression Survey, which is something we have administered since 2019. Joining us today is Dr. Sean Stevens, as I already said. Sean, love to have you say a few things about yourself, your intellectual background, and what you do at FIRE.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me and having me today. Sean Stevens, as Alex said, I am the Chief Research Advisor at FIRE. With the Vice President of Research, I essentially run the research department there. Main things that I work on are the college free speech rankings, which we'll talk a bit about today. That's been running since 2020. And I'm also in charge of the campus deplatforming database. That used to be what was our disinvitation database, but we expanded it to include things beyond speakers. And then I'm also involved in all the other research projects that FIRE does, but those are kind of my two main ones. My PhD is in psychology, social psychology, from Rutgers University. And my research is basically a lot of mix of political psychology, well, more recently getting into the psychological motivations of censorship.
Great,
Yeah,
thanks. Well,
let's get started.
yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the recent research offerings that both HxA and FIRE have produced in recent past, but are also working on in the pipeline that pertain to the topic of campus expression. So I've already mentioned the Campus Expression Survey, which is Heterodox Academy's flagship research product at the moment, which we've released so far 2 research briefs, very small. I call them like tapas when it comes to, they're not like the big tomahawk steak of a research report that you sort of see with the college free speech rankings. They're tapas, small plates. And these 2 research briefs derive from survey data that we got from a survey we administered last fall from about mid-November to the end of the calendar year. So right at a very spicy time on university campuses. And some of the main takeaways that I'd just like to highlight, perhaps unsurprisingly, the main sort of hot topic on campus, the one for which there was a lot of reluctance. About 47% of our respondents on the Campus Expression Survey indicated that they were at least somewhat reluctant to talk about it. That topic was Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, not surprising given the events of October 7th. So right after that, the next most contentious topic, or rather the topic that most people were, or that a lot of people were expressed some reluctance to want to talk about, is politics. It'll be interesting to see, what happens this fall, given that there's an election that's going to be very contentious. So that's one takeaway. Israeli-Palestinian conflict has really driven a lot of the news cycle around campus expression over the past few months. And because of that, we actually, I think last week, we released a special research report deriving from our campus expression survey data, specifically on reluctance to discuss Israeli-Palestinian conflict on campus. And the nugget I just want to highlight in that research brief, I encourage you to visit our website and download it and peruse it. We found this very interesting relationship. So one of the things we measure on the Campus Expression Survey is sort of, it's not clear how to phrase it, whether it's intensity or extremity of political affiliation. So it's a kind of spectrum. You have very left on one side, very right on the other side. And what we found is that the more you were at either extreme, the more comfortable respondents were in discussing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But that as you sort of move towards the center, though I'm drawing an inverted U here because the y-axis in the figure in the report is a measure of reluctance. But the more as you move to the center, the more reluctant people ended up being, which I find to be a very interesting sort of finding. Sean, I know that FIRE has been doing some surveys about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'd love to hear you share some insights and some nuggets, some takeaways from some of that research.
Yeah, so since 2020, as part of this College Free Speech Ranking Survey, we have a question that asks students to identify the social political topics that they find difficult to have an open and honest conversation about on campus. Some of these topics have been asked about every year. One of them is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But others, we kind of rotate in or out. Like this year, we have the election on there. That wasn't on there last year because it's not really a hot topic, not potentially a hot topic. But we find something very similar to what Alex just described from the Campus Expression Survey. So our ranking survey this year, I'm going to give you like a little preview that those are going to come out September 10th, but I'll give a little preview of some of the data here. We asked the survey in the spring semester. So it was running from January 17th till about mid-June. So we got it at also a spicy time. We turned the survey back on after the encampment protest started at any campus that we had closed it So we actually have some very interesting data where we can do comparisons of before versus during. But on Israel-Palestine itself, I mean, all of FIRE's data this year, not just from the ranking survey, but from some of our other databases as well, suggests that that topic has, in effect, become almost an all-consuming one on campus. So we found 54% of students nationwide identified Israeli-Palestinian conflict as difficult to discuss on campus. On some campuses, this was over 80%. Others, obviously, below 50, but to bring it down. But I mean, that's, to me, some of that's very eye-opening in a sense. And interestingly, like we've always kind of seen in years past that more elite schools find this, like the Ivies and some of your elite R1 public institutions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is always consistently more difficult to discuss there compared to other campuses. Now that's kind of changing a little bit, we're seeing. Non-survey data, going to our databases, the majority, like we're on pace for a record number of deplatforming attempts on campus this year. Last year set a record with like 100, roughly around like 150. We already have recorded like 110 or so this year, and we still have the fall semester to go. The majority of those are involving speech over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or some kind of expression over it. And then to kind of buttress one of the other points Alex raised, we did a separate survey on 30 campuses specifically about the encampment protests. So this was launched in May and ran for about a month. On this, we kind of took we modified one of our questions where we asked, how comfortable or uncomfortable are you expressing your views on a controversial political topic in various settings? We asked them how comfortable or uncomfortable they were discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with other students. And we find pretty similarly that the people most comfortable are those identifying as very liberal or very conservative.
Yeah, very interesting. So we do have a question here that's pertinent to what we're discussing in the Q&A. So I figured we might take the opportunity to riff on this question.
Mm-hmm.
The question said that I said students in the political middle are the most hesitant to discuss Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And maybe that doesn't mean they're self-censoring necessarily. Maybe it means they're intellectually humble, that they don't know enough to speak to the issues. That's a fair point. At least I'll just answer from my own perspective. That's a fair point. I do want to point out a kind of subtlety. Whether it's a subtlety that makes a difference, I honestly don't know. But there is a subtlety in the way that at least this most recent version of the Campus Expression Survey asked respondents about various contentious issues. So in previous versions of the Campus Expression Survey, that question was framed in terms of how willing respondents were to express their opinions about a given controversial subject. For this past version, we revised that wording and instead asked people about whether they're comfortable or reluctant to discuss their questions, their thoughts, and their ideas. Now, the difference there is rather than talking about expressing your opinion, maybe people don't have an opinion. Nonetheless, people might have questions, they might have ideas, they might have thoughts that are not necessarily fully formed opinions. And so that's the way we rephrase the question. And that, I think, I was responsible for that change. The idea there is that I wanted to move the survey towards more of a framing in terms of HxA's value of open inquiry, right? So to what extent are students willing to engage in inquiry? So suppose that they don't really know much about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How are you going to learn more about Israeli-Palestinian conflict? By engaging in inquiry. But if it turns out that people aren't even willing to ask their questions or share their inchoate thoughts, well, maybe that's a problem. So I know that maybe Sean has something to say about some of the framing differences here, but Sean, why don't you take a stab at that question as well?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a mix among the moderates. I think there might be some people who there's certainly some people who would quote be intellectually humble or just, they don't feel they know enough about the issue to say anything. There's probably people who just don't want to get involved in the conversation because they don't like disagreeable conversations. But I also think there will be students that are afraid, like that they are afraid to kind of bring this topic up for various reasons. There's a second follow-up. There's another question here in the Q&A that I think that can be relevant. So we'll bring this up here. I don't think either one of us have survey data that could answer this question as to whether or not students are reluctant to discuss this topic because they don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism, but that seems like a fairly reasonable thing for some students to feel as well. To that point, I think, the conflict ideologically, I think, is mapped on where, more liberal progressive students are endorsing more pro-Palestinian speech, and the more conservative students are kind of opposed to that speech or endorsing pro-Israeli speech. And so on our crosstabs here for that question, I said about 54% identified the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as difficult to discuss. The highest percentage is among very liberal students at 64%. Moderates are at 52, and then conservatives are below, or 50% or below. So I think that does make sense that could make sense to a degree for some of these very liberal students. They might be afraid of saying XYZ because they know they could be called anti-Semitic by their peers. So
let's keep talking a little bit about we've got a bunch of questions here. Well, we have one question where there's a kind of suggestion about other survey questions that might help. That's a fair point. So we do have a question about crosstabs. I'll just say that in our data, of course, we found that political views do have a pretty significant effect on how reluctant or how willing people are to discuss various contentious issues. One sort of interesting thing we did this year on the campus expression survey is we added some individual difference measures. So we administered the 10-item personality inventory, and we also administered the left-wing authoritarianism scale, which is developed by Tom Costello and some collaborators. And one of them, Sean, there we go. There were a lot of co-authors on that paper, so I don't remember all of them. But what we found is that actually left-wing authoritarianism predicts a significant level of comfort in discussing contentious issues, which is sort of interesting. And that if you score sort of low on that, it also turns out that you're a little more reluctant. So we're actually going to be working on. We've got to see how the analyses go when we replicate them, but we may be publishing a small research brief on, broadly speaking, individual differences or personality and comfort and reluctance discussing contentious issues. So that's I encourage people actually, if they're interested, we make a big chunk of the data available publicly, and if you want to go and run your own analyses, go and do it. And I think FIRE is happy to share.
Oh yeah, for sure.
part of another thing that you're involved with, Sean, is this kind of transparency effort in social science. So in keeping with, I think if you just write Sean or someone at FIRE, they're happy to share all that.
Yeah, you can email data@thefire.org and that'll go to me. So then I will send you the data files of our ranking. All of our survey data is available, and we're happy to. Our databases are living databases, so they're constantly updated, but we're happy to send you the most current file. And then the way we tend to work with analyses with those is we just note, as of this date, these are the counts basically in these databases, but we're definitely happy to share all of our data with you as well.
Yeah. So we have a question here about sampling methodology. I think that's a fun kind of nitty-gritty technical question we could talk about a little bit, and then maybe we'll want to move on to some of the history behind the CES and the college free speech rankings. But the sampling methodology for the campus expression survey, this year we contracted with a company called Cloud Research to get our respondents. So we managed to get about, I think it was 5,009 respondents to the campus expression survey after sort of cleaning and weeding out bad respondents and some pre-processing, we ended up with a final sample of, I think, 4,730, which is about 3 times what we've had in previous campus expression surveys. I will say it's not a probability sample. It's not a random sample. So we don't, I couldn't say, and I do in the report, we're pretty clear about being very circumspect about generalizing from the characteristics of the particular sample that we had to the population at large. But that's a bit about the sampling methodology for the campus expression survey. You can go to our data and methods appendix, which is online on our website, and you can see a little bit more about the sampling methodology. We did try to ensure that our sample was representative of the college student population in general, and there our benchmark was the National Center for Education Statistics Integrated Post-Secondary Education Database System, the IPED system. So Shauna, you want to say a little bit about how FIRE gets its...
Yeah, so I'll just quickly on what we do is like we partner with College Pulse. They have a panel of over 850,000 college students and some recent grads. They have a very, I can't really get into some of their proprietary stuff, but they have a very rigorous process for validating that these are actually living, breathing college students at the universities, that they are supposedly at. They also draw on a number of sources, including the IPEDS database, but some others. So we do post-stratification weighting. So we have a weight that's an overall weight we can apply to our data that makes it a nationally representative sample of college students. We do a weight for each individual school. So when we're analyzing the individual schools, we create a representative sample from those schools. And then this year, we've also, with Pulse, we've calculated what we're calling like a school universe weight, which is actually like the schools we survey, like a representative sample of them. So like the weight variable is like nationally for all, 4-year college undergrads. The school universe one would be just the schools we surveyed when you're looking at them overall.
So while we're talking about sampling methodology, let's talk a little bit about the history of both the Campus Expression Survey and the College Free Speech Rankings. And Sean is a perfect person to have on for this particular topic because he is, believe it or not, the originator, the primary architect of both. Before we get to that, I want to say a little bit about recent history of the Campus Expression Survey. So I've been at HxA for almost a year now, and I helped develop the 2023 version of the Campus Expression Survey. And as I've already mentioned, we did sort of subtly shift the wording to emphasize more open inquiry and not so much like free expression, the free expression framing. So you might think, oh, geez, the Campus Expression Survey, you're shifting away. I mean, that's a kind of important label, and we didn't want to change the label, but we have altered some of the wording of the questions. We did add some new issues to the contentious issues list, Israeli-Palestinian conflict being kind of the main one, obvious, given what happened last fall and what's still happening. And we also added these individual difference measures just to sort of give us more interesting analyses that we could run. So that's kind of the recent history, but Sean, I'd love to hear you talk about the sort of more the ancient history, relatively speaking, of the Campus Expression Survey, and how it came to take the shape that it sort of has.
Yeah, so the history of the survey goes back to 2016, when I started as the first research director of Heterodox Academy. At that time, we were very small. I was the first employee, so it was basically me and John Haidt in his office in NYU, working on, initially the idea was we wanted to create a measure that faculty could employ in their classrooms to kind of get a pulse of how their students felt expressing their views in class. It was designed in a way, like the wording was designed in a way to be very adaptable, right? It's like if you're in a sociology class, there might be certain issues you're discussing, but if you're in a different discipline, the issues might be different and you might want to ask about those. So the original wording was like it was designed to kind of be a plug and play thing. People could use it to assess expression in a small group. You could do it in your department. You could do the whole school. We were trying to partner with schools to essentially run that. We successfully did that with Lynn Benton Community College. Mark Uristo, who's a very active Heterodox Academy member, has kind of spearheaded the efforts there and liaisons with their administration. So that their administration of the survey kind of has the full backing of the school, which I think is really cool. But yeah, so like some of the initial samples we collected were, just like we collected a sample for the Qualtrics survey, et cetera. We then built up to running a couple national samples with the initial grant that Heterodox Academy got from the Templeton Foundation. And then that kind of all got warped when the global pandemic occurred. And so I think that was then it kind of got backburnered a little bit. But yeah, so it kind of started more as a tool for faculty. With the goal of Heterodox Academy, it was to be a place for faculty to come together, figure out how to promote open inquiry and viewpoint diversity. It was mostly left of center, libertarianish professors who were concerned about the ideological imbalance in a number of fields. But then basically right after, to put the blog up in 2015, in the fall of 2015, the campus protests around race and racial inequality, and the famous one on Yale's campus where, the Christakises responded to the Halloween email, all of that kind of happened there. And that, in effect, I think made Heterodox Academy's mission much bigger very quickly, made the focus much bigger. And so now we're also focusing on promoting this among students and really just trying to get a handle on what was going on.
Yeah. So, I mean, it has changed over time. We do have a question here about really in the Q&A about the extent to which, given that this survey has changed over time, whether the campus expression survey or for that matter, the college free speech rankings allows us to basically study change over time. Are they designed for do they collect longitudinal data? The sampling is non-random and the questions are changing subtly every year to year. I think it really depends on, so my answer to this question is, at least with respect to the campus expression survey, it depends on what the purpose of the survey is. Is the purpose of the survey actually to be something longitudinal and to track change over time? Or is the purpose of the survey to really give us a kind of snapshot insight into what's going on college campuses? And I think you can answer, I think there's value in both of those sorts of projects. For my part, I think that where the real value is, and I think this is consonant with how Sean just described the original purpose of the campus expression survey, it really is best suited to just give a kind of snapshot, like temperature check of what's going on campus. Now, I think something like the college free speech rankings, where you're tracking data at an institutional level, I mean, their sample is so much bigger. It's, I think, an order of magnitude bigger than what we're able to get at the campus expression survey, 55,000 respondents or something like that, 250 different institutions. I think that they're set up to really do stuff over a longitudinal period of time. So I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. So I mean, it's a good point about question wording and things like that with surveys and changes over time. I think when you want to certainly be concerned about someone extrapolating trends there is if they've the question has changed radically. So like the first survey we ran in 2020 with the ranking survey, we had a self-censorship question on there. But the response options were yes or no, which binary response options are never very good anyway. But we changed that the next year, and so we don't talk about that data really from that question from 2020 because we changed it, made it a frequency of how often you do this thing, and so we talk about we have 4 years of data on that question essentially because it's been worded exactly the same way for 4 years with the same response options. More subtle changes in wording, I mean, they can move responses around, but I mean, in looking at some questions, we've changed subtly, like with a change a word here, remove a word there, and it's basically asking the same thing. We see very little like movements in how students are responding to it. I think when things are worded similarly enough, and the response options haven't changed radically, you can reasonably like connect those. Like the questions Alex and I were talking about Israel-Palestine earlier, like we asked them in different ways, but they're coalescing around a similar number. So I think that's telling you that it's somewhere around that number, probably. And then in terms of the CFSR in general, for us, for FIRE and myself personally, like the goal was to do both of the things that Alex described. It's to get a snapshot of what's going on at a given time and at individual schools. But we also had the eye of building something that would be like a general social survey for people. And so you can download, you can start, the questions are the same like year after year after year, and you can really track trends in those now. And then a really cool thing, and we have not really taken a deep dive into this yet, but we have students that have taken the survey in multiple years, the same student. So we have cross-sectional data, and we actually have true longitudinal data that we could look at and pull out.
That's very interesting. Like,
Yeah.
so I mean, I'm assuming you can't release those, can't release personally identifying information, but
They have like a respondent ID that we can use to match them. And so we plan on doing things with those. So yeah.
How many how many such students are there, just out of curiosity, in your samples?
So we haven't added this year's pool to the cumulative file we have, but there was I think it was between 7,000 or 8,000.
Oh, so that's
a pretty nice sample, yeah. And then this year's survey, we got close to 59,000 students surveyed.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a big machine you've got there. So we've got a couple of questions here that are about, broadly speaking, international issues outside of the US.
Mhm.
And one person indicates that he or she might have some insider knowledge, but so one of what we're going to do for the Campus Expression Survey here at Heterodox Academy this year is we have some support from a partner in Canada, and we are working with College Pulse to develop a sample of Canadian students, both undergraduates, but also graduate students. That's sort of the marching orders of College Pulse. It's not going to be a huge sample. It's going to be maybe 1,000 to 1,500, but really it's almost exploratory in purpose, just to sort of get a sense for what's going on in Canada. And in that particular survey, we have altered, or we will alter, the list of sort of hot button issues to include things like climate change. In Canada, there's a lot of controversy over Indigenous rights issues. There are these lots of debates about these schools where allegedly First Nations, Indigenous people were abused and maybe even murdered. So we're going to be asking survey response about some of those questions. So that'll give us some handle on to do some cross-national comparisons between Canada and the US. I will say that I'm not aware of any similar surveys that are being done outside of the US or outside of Canada in other countries, like the UK, for example, or in continental Europe. Sean, do you have any line of sight for what's going on maybe in other countries?
So Eric Kaufman's a researcher in the United Kingdom who's done, he studies faculty more than faculty political views more than students, but he does have a few samples of graduate students. And so if you Google him, you'll find it. He's got a number of survey reports out there that he's collected. And I believe he's spearheading an effort over in the United Kingdom to kind of more formally measure things there. Just quickly on the FIRE survey, if one wanted to adapt that, I mean, I think most of those questions could easily be asked in Canada without much editing. But I would edit like the topic list that we have, like the topics that are difficult to discuss, because it should be made more specific to Canadian politics. But I think most of the questions we have could probably just be asked in the format they're in.
Yeah. I will say that one of the challenges of working with surveys in other countries is, we've mentioned College Pulse a few times here, where their bread and butter is really developing respondent panels in the United States. So what we've asked them to do at Heterodox Academy in developing a Canadian sample is actually involves them developing a new respondent panel, which it takes a lot of time and resources from them, and correspondingly a cost from our side in terms to compensate them for that time and effort. But the sampling issue, the big thing with surveys is they're expensive. They cost a lot of money. I know how much we spend in order to run the campus expression survey. It's not a trivial amount of money. And I bet that what the amount of money that FIRE spends to run surveys is at least an order of magnitude, if not more, than what we spend on running the campus expression survey. So they can be a very powerful tool, but correspondingly very expensive tool.
Yeah.
And one big question, and I know FIRE is doing a lot of work sort of trying to source other sorts of data in order to answer questions about what's going on campus. We here at Heterodox Academy are doing the same thing, trying to find more or less cheaper ways of getting good, high quality data that gives us a good sense for what's going on at various levels of institutions of higher education. So I want to move on to a topic. My research in preparing to administer the campus expression survey, Sean, I noticed that in the past couple of years, some public university systems have been more or less mandated by state legislators to start administering basically analogs of campus expression surveys for their public university system. So the schools I know of are Wisconsin, Tennessee, in Indiana. I also know that the University of Austin has committed to doing some kind of annual survey of its student population when it comes to expression related sorts of issues. Do you know of any other universities that are maybe committed to do this?
So I know in Florida, like at the state level, there's a push, but it's more to measure faculty politics and not students. And that's also a thing on the docket in a handful of other states, I believe. But I'm not aware of other states that are pushing the measure on like a measure like that for students.
Yeah.
Universities, yeah.
Yeah, and we actually have a question here that I'd like to take the opportunity to answer here. What are some questions you wish you could ask that you haven't been able to?
Yeah, that's a good one.
I'm gonna take a little bit of a twist on this. There's actually a population that I wish I could sample and that there were an easy way to sample. And that is what I call the future faculty of America. So graduate students in research-oriented doctoral programs. These are the people who are going to be faculty leading our institutions of higher education. And I'd really like to get a better handle on what their views are and what their dispositions and habits with respect to open inquiry and free expression are. And, there's some data I highly recommend anyone who's not familiar with Corey Clark's recent work. She just recently published a paper earlier this year. I don't remember maybe Sean, you were involved on this paper too. But where she surveyed taboo topics. That's the key word for the paper.
My colleague Comey Fry was on that paper, but yeah.
So, and some of the data she has there is a little concerning. Younger faculty tend to be more censorious, and that's a little concerning.
That also dovetails with the data that Eric Kaufman has on graduate students, and those samples were US and Canadian graduate students.
Yeah. So someone has asked for the paper. I will go ahead and drop it in the chat. I think this is the topic, taboos and self-censorship among US psychology professors.
To build a little on what Alex is saying, there's some other populations that I think FIRE is certainly interested in surveying, faculty being one, actual, like not just graduate students, but actual faculty. I actually think they are potentially the most influential forces on the expression climate on a campus, because there's a certain amount of turnover of students every year. Administrators come and go. Yeah. Tenured faculty might stay at a university for 30 plus years. They're pretty influential. So we actually did a survey of faculty of the schools we surveyed in 2020. So those 55, look for that to come out later this fall, probably in like early October. We're gonna have a report on that. And then the other population, administrators. I think that would be the only survey sample study I know of that has looked at college administrators and their attitudes towards free speech. was done by Sam Abrams, and it was done about 8 years ago, something like that. And it was on about a sample of 1,000 administrators. So I mean, I think that's another population that's just we'd love to know more about what they think. And I'd love to be able to factor all that into how we're rating these schools.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. I'd love to sample current faculty, future faculty. I'd love to run crosstabs, disciplinary differences, differences in where people get their PhDs, the usual sorts of demographic differences, yeah, stage of career. I mean, there's a whole lot of analytical work that can be done just to sort of parse out like what do different subgroups think and what are their habits and what are their dispositions. And you know,
Surveying campus staff, as someone just asked a question about, I think that also gives you a pulse on what people think is going on a
yeah,
campus. So
especially
I would get all of them.
especially like student affairs people who run like student orientations or who are residential life sorts of people who have a lot of contact with students, especially outside of a classroom. I think the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few, and the surveys are few. And like I said, surveys are they're labor intensive to put together, and they're just very costly in order to actually put together a sample frame and then get a response rate that's good enough for you to actually do some real good research. Um, but I wanted to say one thing about I mean, I'm actually just sort of curious. Why is it so surveys of college students, especially, I think the first survey of college students was done in the 60s, and I think it's still going on. It's being administered by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA. It was something like cooperative freshman something survey, and so college students are surveyed all the time. And most of the surveys they seem to participate in are, basic demographic information, but also they're really oriented towards how well is the college experience preparing them to get a job. That's generally seems to be sort of the main thrust of a lot of these surveys. I'm genuinely curious why more colleges aren't surveying their students when it comes to open inquiry and expression climate. You'd think, in as much as a university really is an institution whose purpose is to foster inquiry and the discovery, dissemination, transmission, and preservation of knowledge, that they'd be really keen to understand how well or how poorly they are at facilitating that. And the fact that you've got state legislators sort of having to mandate universities to do this is a little bit concerning. I don't know, Sean, do you have any kind of speculative?
Yeah, so fire, we certainly don't like legislative, like people like the legislatures coming in and telling universities what to do. I think it kind of behooves colleges and universities to maybe be proactive and do some of this themselves so that they're not getting heavy hand from politicians who are probably quite skeptical of them, because that's why they're ordering them to do these things. That they're already looking at universities with a healthy bit of skepticism. And so I think the kind of I think it would be much better for universities to take this on themselves and do it. And I think, like the University of Wisconsin did a great job, like over the last year or two. Like they did a student survey. They brought in a number they had an advisory board, a number of outside experts at the schools, like, and they tried to get basically the whole system. And I think that the data was very good. It looks very interesting. I mean, and we're seeing, there's a comment here from April in the one of the survey team members, where she just described that. And I mean, now it looks like they're going to try to go forward and survey faculty in the system. And I think that's a great thing. And it's nice to see not just one campus, but it's like the statewide system is actually being proactive about this.
Yeah, basically trying to get a better handle on
Yeah.
what actually is the state of campus climate when it comes to
Mhm.
inquiry, fostering
And
inquiry,
and
permitting.
you should want to know these things if you're an administrator, right? I don't, I think so. Like we have it's this idea of like, why don't colleges and universities want to measure this? It's like, well, it sounds a little cynical, but I would say there's a good number of them that just don't want to see bad data.
Yeah, makes them look bad. It's a way of holding them accountable. I mean, it is also costly. It's, it's not an easy lift, but
Yeah,
a lot of places have just dedicated offices of institutional
mhm,
research,
they do.
full-time staff, where the only thing they're doing is basically doing research about the institution. And many of these offices of institutional research are stood up in order to help universities and colleges with the accreditation and the reaffirmation of accreditation processes. But that's a whole other topic. I've been
Mhm,
diving a little bit into the accreditation process, and what's kind of interesting is how little the accreditation handbooks that you see from various regional accrediting agencies actually even talk about inquiry and free expression as a core competence or a core value of institution of higher education. So, if there's no incentive really, then yeah, why measure any of this stuff, especially if the data comes back, it makes you look bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, we've actually been in some conversations with a few universities with the idea of can we, and this kind of gets at a question that's on here too, an idea that we have of actually improving things on campus. But it's like, hey, can you adopt an orientation module, that is covers the First Amendment, makes students aware of what it says, what it protects, what it doesn't protect on campus, et cetera. And then we wanted to measure, you would measure people's knowledge and awareness before, we'd measure it right after, and then we would want to measure it much later to see if it actually sticks, because psychology, it's like, yeah, we'll see a brief bump when they sit through this module, but then does it actually stick with them to the end of the semester, to the end of the year, like later in their academic career? The reason we think this would be a good idea is it's like kind of related. It's not narrowly exactly the same thing, but there's a lot of evidence that people who are more aware of civil liberties and like what the different constitutional, like what is protected and not protected by the Constitution, they're more tolerant. And people who are more tolerant tend to also, it seems to be correlated with being more, viewpoint diverse and open to hearing things. So we think that would help. But we get into these conversations with universities and they are interested. I don't think they're not interested, but it always gets to the point of, yeah, well, but like, what if the data's bad? You're fired. You're probably then gonna call us out for bad, like for it. And so it ultimately doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of comments. There's one comment or question that I think is something that you and I discussed, that brings up a topic that you and I, Sean, before we had this meeting, wanted to discuss, and that is basically, what can we do
Mhm.
if people are becoming more censorious, if they're becoming more cagey when it comes to expression and open inquiry, what can we do about it? And I think that in the background of that question is a set of questions about what kind of, to use a somewhat nerdy word, like what kind of causal models do we have of basically campus climate around free expression, around open inquiry? Like if we wanted to draw like the graph, the causal graph, like what would the different nodes on that graph be? And that having a causal model in mind is one way of thinking about like interventions. We can intervene on this variable, we can intervene on this variable. What are some of your thoughts on this, Sean?
So I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there's probably at least there's a number of buckets that would feed into how to feed into understanding the expression climate on campus. So, fire tracks and rates, speech policies that are on the books. They're rated based on whether, do they pass constitutional muster or not. And like we think those seem to have an impact. They do, on the climate on campus. So there's the institutional policies, and within that, then that one of the quote big fish type of people that could, or types of people that could influence the climate is, as we mentioned before, administrators. High level administrators are setting the policies. More mid level like administrators who are in more managerial positions are like enforcing said policies, right? Like when students complain or faculty complain, or there's just a reason to enforce it, they're the ones kind of in charge of enforcing them as well. So I think they have a lot to do with it. I think there's also, there's the campus itself, but a college or university exists within a community, like a surrounding community that has its own views, political values, quirks, etc. So there's evidence from work by Amy Binder. She's been doing work on this for a long time. That the surrounding area of a campus impacts students' politics, impacts the expression climate, things like that. And there's a national climate too, as we're seeing, and we discussed with both of our data from the past year. I mean, Israel-Palestine has become almost an all-consuming thing on campuses across the country, right? It waxes and wanes, and some of it's not as big of a deal, but others it's a very serious issue. But this is a national issue that's impacting colleges and universities now.
Yeah.
I think those are all factors, and I know we've discussed more, so I'll kick it over to Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would just highlight as well, and so we've kind of identified a couple different variable types, you might say. There's like institutional policies. There's kind of just like the disposition, the character of university administrators, leadership. And then there's kind of the water everyone swims in, like the larger culture, the local culture, right? The surrounding campus, the national, the international discussion and culture. We have one participant in this webinar who makes a note about social media. We will have a research brief coming out from our campus expression survey that talks a little bit about what it is that students ascribe to, or what fears they would sort of cite as reasons for being reluctant. And being mobbed on social media is one such fear that shows up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple of variable types. One thing I'd want to point out is that when a freshman sets foot on campus, they're immediately bombarded with all these orientation programs. My colleague Martha McCoy, who's the director of campus engagement and campus communities at Heterodox Academy, she and I were messaging earlier today about some of these student orientation programs. And there are companies that make lots of money selling these to universities. There was one that had the kind of hilarious marketing pitch that this is an opportunity for you to learn about like how not to sexually harass other students, and that the tagline they said is something like Title IX but with sock puppets, which I thought was sort of hilarious. But there's all these student orientation programs, and what's fascinating is just looking at the lineup of your typical student orientation programming. It's basically like programming intended to prevent students from engaging in sexual harassment or sexual misconduct, which is good. Like, you don't want your students to do that. There's programming about basically not getting drunk and wasted on campus. There's programming about mental health. There's programming about a variety of other things, but there's basically nothing that's focused on what you might think is the bread and butter of going to college, which is inquiry, learning, habits of mind for the intellectual life, learning to cope with different opinions, instruction about free expression, First Amendment, free speech, and all these things. I mean, they're bombarded with all these programs, and none of them really address some of the core issues about the life of the mind, what it is to inquire, what it is to learn, have your mind expanded, to be challenged. And so one just hypothesis I have is if we could kind of shift some of that student orientation programming in the direction of just actually having students confronted early on with the fact that, look, college is about more than just the football team and tailgating and meeting attractive people of the opposite or same sex, depending on your orientation. But it's about learning. It's about having your views challenged. It's about arguments, about evidence. It's about inquiry. That might help a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah,
So.
well, I mean, I think to build on that a little bit, it's so like take an incident like it that happened at Stanford. Not, I guess it was over. It's like maybe a year and a half ago now at this point. But the Judge Duncan shout down. I mean, I know that's at the law school. It's not undergrads. It's that those are graduate level students, but those were law students shouting down a federal judge. There's evidence of this in peer-reviewed scholarship that conservative law students like wind up they're more knowledgeable about the law, and they're more successful at defending their arguments when they become lawyers because their arguments have been much more strongly challenged in their law school experience than the more liberal progressive ones. And I think like that incident right there, it's like a reason you bring someone like Judge Duncan in is, well, like you guys, you're going to be lawyers. Whether you like it or not, you might encounter this argument from someone, from an opposing counsel, or you might have to argue in front of Judge Duncan on the bench, like, right? And you're going to be aware of what his views are of things. But it to not be exposed to it and then not be able to, if you're not exposed to it, I don't think you can really fully understand it.
Yeah.
And you should and when you're exposed to it, you can actually challenge him in a way that might show that his views are kind of, untenable, or they shouldn't be, maybe they need to be changed or whatever. But I think like that's like really important is you're here and you're learning and you're kind of it's about some of these things that are fun, but it's also about you're becoming like a citizen and learning how to act as like a citizen like once you leave college. And those ideas are out there in the world and they're not going to go away. So you can't just kind of like you would on social media hide them or just ignore them. Like you're gonna encounter them. So you might as well get some practice.
Yeah. There's a book that was plugged in the Atlantic a couple weeks ago by Lauren Wright, who's a political scientist at Princeton University. The book is called Tested: Why Conservative Students Get the Most Out of Liberal Education. And she makes basically that exact
Yeah.
point, that actually conservative students, because they undergo trial by fire on average, they're just better positioned intellectually, it seems, to defend their views in public. Now, you might think, it's not great to be in the pressure cooker. It'd be nice to be able to have your views challenged in a more friendly environment.
And I actually think conservative college students might be this kind of quirky, interesting population. I think they're different from your typical conservative out there in the general public. And so like they're just like a very interesting population, I think.
They kind of select into the position that
They're
they.
selected into these environments in many cases.
Yeah. Well,
um,
we're coming to the end
yeah,
here, and I want to really thank you, Sean, for taking the time to share your expertise and your perspectives with us. I hope that our webinar participants really got a lot out of it. I'm grateful for them, grateful to them for showing up and asking real interesting questions. Sean, I don't know if you believe in social media, if you've got any kind of social media presence, and if you do, whether you want to share it. If you've got any work you
yeah.
want to plug here, this is your chance.
Yeah, so I'd encourage everyone, you can check out the fire.org. I'll use this opportunity to answer one last question here. Yes, FIRE has some student orientation stuff on the site, so you could go check that out there. We've got a lot of other things as well. You can find the deplatforming database, Scholars Under Fire database. Like I said, if you email data@thefire.org, you'll get me. And I'm happy to share our data with you. I'd also encourage you to check out our news desk, which is basically our blog. There's also Greg Lukianoff's Substack, The Eternally Radical Idea, where the research department at FIRE publishes a good amount of stuff. Kind of longer form things that wouldn't go on the news desk blog. We could take a little bit of a deeper dive. FIRE has a heavy social media presence. I have a personal Twitter account that I don't use. I just don't want someone tweeting in my name.
I do too, and I'm not going to share my Twitter handle because I mostly just post about football. So
I think I've sent maybe 10 tweets in total in my entire life. I peruse Twitter, but I'm not very active on it. I find it easier to kind of keep calm and not get into really bad disagreements.
So at Heterodox Academy, we also have a giant resources page, which we encourage you to visit. And we are developing a new student orientation program, which hopefully will be live in the next few months. And again, we're just very grateful for everyone for tuning in. We hope you learned something. We are going to grab some of the questions that we were not able to answer and save those. And, Sean and I are going to do our best to sort of follow up in some way, and answer those questions to the best of our ability. But thanks again, everyone. It's 4 o'clock Eastern time. Have a good rest of your day, Sean. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Farewell, everyone.